So I'm going to talk on tragedy. I'm Chris Janaway from the Philosophy Department. One of the things I've been interested in over the years. I'm just really going to talk about, give you a few snapshots of the history of what some of the philosophers who've thought about this topic have said over the centuries. And we go right back to Plato at some point here. So tragedy. By tragedy, in this discussion, we don't mean a catastrophe or an atrocity or something awful happening. This is an extension, a metaphorical, figurative use. So, if people die in a plane crash, it's not a tragedy in my sense. It's a catastrophe, an atrocity, an awful thing to happen. A tragedy is primarily an artwork, a dramatic narrative in which a certain sequence of events takes place, in which something disastrous happens to a human being or some human beings as a result of their own actions. So typical tragedies obviously are Shakespearean tragedies, but also the real paradigm is the ancient tragedies, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides tragedies, Oedipus Rex, Antigone, the Bacchae, the plays that we now have from antiquity. This is where tragedy was invented. These are the paradigms of tragedy. The tragedy can occur in other art forms, though, in other narrative forms. A novel could be tragic. A film could be tragic. So it's about a particular shape of narrative. And it's possible that you could say that certain events in real life could be tragic if they adopt this structure. Someone makes a mistake, or a mistake of character, or a small thing that they do leads to catastrophic results for them because of their actions, because of the situation they find themselves in. This, you might say, certain people's actual lives have a tragic structure, or parts of them do. But I'm particularly going to be talking about the tragic dramas, the tragic artworks. Why are these important, and what is important about them to us are, I suppose, the really prime questions that philosophers have asked. And it became in modern times quite fashionable to think there was something very paradoxical about tragedy. It seems that we really like watching these things. It seems that we get pleasure from it. And yet, it seems that what we're getting pleasure from is something inherently painful. So there's two ways of putting that. On the one hand, the events portrayed are extremely painful. Someone's whole life is destroyed, people get murdered, their families fall apart, they're in utter despair. So these seem to be painful, paradigmatic, painful events that are portrayed. We enjoy seeing them portrayed. But then perhaps also people have thought our own responses to these things as we watch them might be negative or painful. We might feel grief-stricken, we might feel pity, we might feel anxiety and fear. So how come then we think that we're also enjoying ourselves? Isn't this very paradoxical? So perhaps the classic statement of this is by David Hume, and the first extract. This was written obviously in the mid-1700s. Really what I'm giving you is some snapshots of what the great philosophers have said about these issues, just to get us thinking about what the issues might be. And they're still things that people discuss today. So Hume says, it's a wonderful passage, it seems an unaccountable pleasure. Can't explain it. Why would we find this enjoyable? Unaccountable pleasure that the spectators of a well-written tragedy receive from sorrow, terror, anxiety, and other passions that are in themselves disagreeable and uneasy. But then, even more paradoxical and strange, the more they're touched and affected, the more they're delighted. So, if it's only a little bit terrifying, if Macbeth thinks, hold on a minute, ambition's not really worth it, and perhaps I'll just give up and go and tend my estate peacefully. It's disappointing. We don't like that. Okay, we like him to go on a murderous rampage in pursuit of power and have his downfall. Okay, so they're more delighted, the more they're touched and affected, the more they're delighted with the spectacle. As soon as the uneasy passions cease to operate, the piece is at an end. The whole heart of the poet is employed in rousing and supporting passion, indignation, anxiety, resentment. They're pleased in proportion as they are afflicted, and never are so happy as when they employ tears, sobs and cries to give vent to their sorrow and relieve their hearts swollen with the tenderest sympathy and compassion. This is David Hume, it's wonderful stylistic lesson. So he thinks it's unaccountable. It's strange, isn't it? He tries to give an account, which is not really all that plausible. He says that because we take pleasure in the artistry, we take pleasure in the beauty of the language. You think of this perhaps with Shakespeare. Perhaps there's music, there's beautiful costume. The way the whole performance is carried out is so pleasing in itself that the strength of that pleasure somehow co-opts the strength of the sorrow and makes it into one feeling. But people have thought it's a bit hard to know how a sorrow can be still present and yet transformed into a pleasure. How does that really happen? So his answer is interesting, but people have often not found it all that convincing. So you might begin to step back from this a little bit and say, well, are we really sure that what's going on here is pleasure? Right? Maybe one way of removing the paradox would be to say, well, tragedy might be a good thing, it might have value of some kind for us, but not all value is reducible to pleasure, right? So maybe learning things is valuable, finding out truths or exploring possible truths, imagining what things would be like. Maybe that's not particularly pleasurable, but maybe it's important for us to do, so maybe it's valuable. Maybe there's an education or a developmental kind of reason why tragedy is a good thing, and maybe pleasure isn't what we should be looking for, right? But it seems that's a little hard to accept that, as if, we're just learning a hard lesson, and we don't have to enjoy it. Perhaps you can find out these things about life in some other way, right? Or the really difficult, I think, point about that is, why would we go and see it again? Why do we seek out tragedies? Oh, good, King Lear's on, I must go and see it. Well, if the point is to learn that people torture one another and power can be corrupting and all the other particular details that occur in that wonderful play, I've seen it once, I know all those things now. If there's no pleasure involved, why would I go through it again? So it does seem difficult to settle on whether there's a case of some value without pleasure, or whether there really is pleasure. If there is pleasure, something like Hume's paradox or unaccountableness still seems in the offing. We have to decide, why is this a good thing? Why do we seek them out, if indeed they are painful? The other way to go, of course, is to say, we're not really feeling any pain. We could resolve the paradox by saying, well, we're just enjoying a spectacle. We're not really feeling fear, because we know that it's not really happening, right? It's fiction. So we're imagining what it would be like to be in Macbeth's or Scotland, or Lear's Britain, or Oedipus's Thebes. It would be terrible for these characters. We can see how fearful the situation is for Oedipus. We can see how shameful it is, how pitiful a character he is, but we're not actually feeling anything, because we know he's not real. We're feeling excited by the narrative, but we're not really feeling pain. So that would be the other way to go. So it's less paradoxical. We're just enjoying, imagining how fearful and pitiful it would be, but that's just pleasure. So we can think a little bit about the dynamics of this, about what we want to say, whether there's a kind of pain with no pleasure, or a kind of pleasure with no pain, or whether Hume's right that there's something odd and unaccountable going on. The debate about tragedy, I'll just leave that hanging. We can discuss that, okay, if you've got any intuitions or views about that particular so-called paradox. The debate about the value of tragedy goes right back to the culture that invented tragedy, the ancient Greeks. Tragedy was perhaps their great art form, certainly in the literary and dramatic tradition. Also, they invented comedy, of course. But the dramatic festivals in Athens, for example, were extremely important public occasions. People, I think, were actually paid to go, and they were competitions. Everybody went. 3 days of tragedies, and you had to vote for the best one, and so on. So it was a really serious cultural event. We find, though, Plato and Aristotle, the two great philosophers of that period, disagreeing about whether tragedy is a good thing or not. So Plato takes a very negative view, interestingly. Plato himself, a great literary artist, wonderful writer, said to have written plays in his youth. By the tradition that we have about Plato, he started out writing plays and then sort of became a philosopher. He still writes in dramatic form, he writes dialogues. But he thinks that poetry, in particular dramatic poetry, is harmful. So this is my second part of what he says in the Republic here, a very famous discussion about poetry and in particular tragedy. He thinks that Plato takes the view that tragedy genuinely provokes our emotions, right? It genuinely makes us feel fear and pity and maybe other things, shame and disgust and resentment and anger, all sorts of things. And he thinks that it does so in a way where we feel that it's safe to experience and express those emotions. Because, after all, it's not our own lives. It's something alien happening that we're witnessing. But, he says, this will have an effect on your own life. You will then learn, you will train yourself to be governed by emotion, not by rational thought and understanding. So Plato makes quite a divide between rationality. So Plato thinks, in the rest of the Republic, he thinks we can work out what the good life is. We can work out a method for discovering truths about what's valuable in life. We can do ethics, but we do it by rational argument. We do it by philosophy. We don't do it by art or poetry or drama. Those are just ways of enticing us into a world of emotion. Right? So he thinks of the world of emotion as potentially harmful to our ability to reason and to work out what is good in life. But there's something very enticing about art and about drama that Plato recognizes. And in this rather subtle passage, some of his criticisms are not so subtle, but in this particular passage I've got on the handout, it's quite a subtle argument. So he says, he's talking about the best of us, people who are really educated and have a really good idea of how to live their lives, good people, virtuous people, excellent human beings. Even us, even the best of us, when we hear Homer, so he's thinking of the epic poems as a kind of a preliminary to the tragic tradition, but we particularly think of tragedy here. Whenever the best of us hear Homer or some tragedian imitating one of the heroes, sorrowing and making long lamenting speech, or singing and beating his breast, you know that we enjoy it. Give ourselves up to following it. Sympathize with the hero, take his suffering seriously, and praise as a good poet the one who affects us most in this way. So that's similar to what Hume was saying many centuries later. The poet's really good if the poet gets us really emotionally involved with this person, who is of course only fictional. But then he says, I suppose only a few are able to figure out that enjoyment of other people's sufferings is necessarily transferred to our own, and that the pitying part of us is if it's nourished and strengthened on the sufferings of others, won't be easily held in check when we ourselves suffer. So the right reaction to sufferings in your life is to take a purely rational view about them, not to go on sobbing and lamenting and crying. He thinks this is a kind of childish reaction that we all have, but we should resist it. What drama does is it sucks us into a kind of safe realm where all these childish emotions, as he literally calls them, are allowed free play, but actually we should be resisting them. Plato is very aware of how powerful dramatic poetry and art is, and he actually says, shortly after this passage, he says, We have to resist it in the way that we resist the charms of someone we've fallen in love with, but who we reason is not the right person. So we have to keep repeating these arguments to ourselves because a drama is so attractive to us, but it's dangerous because the attraction is one that subverts our rationality, subverts our ability to see things fair and square. Does the poet really know what's good and bad in human life? What's the best way to lead a life? Not really. The poet just entertains us with images that we get emotionally involved with. It's the philosopher that knows, according to Plato, not the poet. So that's a very negative view of the greatest art form of his time, really. So it's quite a radical, unpopular view. Aristotle, of course, knew Plato, disagreed with him about virtually everything, wrote a book called The Poetics, which has been extremely influential throughout the history of literature, influential on later theories of tragedy particularly. In effect, it's a defense of tragedy against some of these, or partially anyway, a defense of tragedy against some of these complaints by Plato. So Aristotle says both, in the first little extract I've got here from the Poetics, a famous quote, poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history. It speaks of universals. A universal comprises the kind of speech or action which belongs by probability or necessity to a certain kind of character. So we're learning the kinds of things that human beings do. Even though it seems to be about Oedipus or Macbeth or some individual character, they stand in for kinds of character. So we're learning the sorts of things that can happen in sorts of situations in human life. And Aristotle thinks this is a way of understanding, a way of learning about human life. And we naturally, Aristotle also famously says, we naturally learn from mimesis. Mimesis is this Greek concept of imitation or representation. It's natural to human beings to learn by looking at images of things. How do we teach children? Children don't see lions first, they see pictures of lions. We learn, it's absolutely natural to human beings to gain understanding of things by a representation. So Plato's idea that there's some fishy thing going on here where we're pretending all sorts of things and deceiving the mind. Aristotle says, well, no, human beings naturally handle images and representation. It's part of our nature to do so, which I think is a much more sane view. Aristotle famously thought that a tragedy only really a good tragedy if it provokes pity and fear. If it does, there's all sorts of stories you could tell, fairy stories, adventure stories, thrillers, comedies, romantic comedies, and they all provoke different emotions and reactions. Unless it promotes fear and pity, it is not a tragedy, or it's not working as a tragedy, unless it is such as to do so. So in this slightly long extract from the Poetics, he says this. So the poet is trying to get us to feel these emotions. The effect of fear and pity, he says, you can get that from theatrical spectacle. You can startle people out of their wits if you want, when all sorts of explosions going off on stage or whatever. But that's not what tragedy is really about. Tragedy is about understanding the plot, understanding the sequence of events and why one thing led to another. So part of Plato's objection is, well, the poet's just out to give us pleasure by doing whatever. As long as we're pleased, the poet's happy. But Aristotle's got a much more subtle insight, I think, into pleasure. Pleasure has particular object. So you might be pleased by the costumes. You might be pleased by the stage machinery that brings in some dragon or something at the end. I don't know. There's not many of those in Greek tragedy, but there were various things that they could do to make dramatic effects. You might be pleased by the music. Greek drama always was a musical event, or the dance movements, or whatever. But Aristotle's saying, yeah, okay, you can be pleased by all those things, but there's a characteristic pleasure that is appropriate to tragedy, and that is the pleasure through understanding how the sequence of events unfolds and feeling the right emotions about it, feeling why it's pitiful for Oedipus to be in this state, and feeling fear about what might happen to him. If the tragedy does that, it's well constructed, it's a proper one. So that's what he says here. The effect of fear and pity can arise from theatrical spectacle, but it can also arise from the intrinsic structure of the events, and it's this which matters more and is the task of a superior poet. For the plot structure ought to be so composed that even without seeing a performance, anyone who hears the events which will occur will experience terror and pity as a result of the outcome. This is what someone would feel while hearing the plot of the Oedipus. Discovers gradually over the play that he's killed his own father, married his own mother, and that this is a sin which will bring complete destruction and pestilence upon his whole kingdom. It's him discovering that is what happens in that play. And he says, if you really hear that story told, doesn't matter if you don't see a spectacle, you'll still feel terror and pity. So, and importantly again, it's not every pleasure, but the appropriate one, which should be sought from tragedy. Since the poet ought to provide the pleasure which derives from fear and pity by means of mimesis, so this is his definition of tragedy, it's evident this ought to be embodied in the events of the plot. So a good tragedy is one which represents events to which the appropriate reaction is fear and pity. And we get pleasure from that because we're understanding properly how this kind of event in human life would unfold and what we should feel about it. And Aristotle's view actually about emotions is very different from Plato's in general. He thinks that being a good person is largely about feeling the right things. He says you can feel anger too much or too little. You can feel pity too much or too little. Feeling it in the right way towards the right objects at the right time, he famously says, that's what characteristic of excellence, of virtue. So to be a good person is to have appropriate emotions. How do we get appropriate emotions? By feeling them. Right? It's a habit that we have to acquire through life by feeling them. So in a way, tragedy is part of an ordinary way of becoming a good person. It's a way of understanding how to feel, if you like, how to feel appropriately. And many people have thought, well, that sounds like a kind of educational aim, as it were, for tragedy. Some people have said, well, it sounds a bit odd because surely you wouldn't be able to respond appropriately to tragedy unless you already knew. You could already recognize what was pitiful in this situation, what was fearful in it. So it can't be that it's a kind of an educational manual for us, as it were. It's more that the educated person will see reflected back to them what in some sense they already know, but in a more powerful, pleasurable form. So it's a kind of reminder almost of our knowledge of how to respond appropriately to things. There are many questions there about what makes an emotion appropriate, whether emotions really do play a part in the good life and what part they play and so on. This is Aristotle's rather humane, I think, view, quite influential still on ethics and aesthetics today. So I just thought two modern philosophers, 19th century philosophers who I'm very interested in are Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and they both have quite a lot to say about tragedy. Nietzsche in particular wrote his first book was The Birth of Tragedy, in which he tries to give an account of why this particular art form in the Greek world was such a powerful art form. It's a difficult book, The Birth of Tragedy. I'm going to give you a hint of why I think it's important. But he was partly responding to Schopenhauer, who was writing in the early to middle part of the 19th century. Schopenhauer thinks that tragedy, one reason why tragedy is really important, one of the most important art forms, is that it tells us the truth. Schopenhauer's view is human life is pretty terrible. There's no ultimate purpose to life. We go through life having desires, wanting all sorts of things, maybe getting them, maybe not, but nothing's ever stable and permanent. In the end, you just die. There's no purpose to life. There's no end that you can finally reach. So happiness is in some sense an illusion. So Schopenhauer has the view that suffering actually permeates life. Maybe very small, you're a bit uncomfortable, or there's something you want and you don't get it, or you're bored for a while. All of these are forms of suffering. And on Schopenhauer's view, people often think a rather one-sided view, the whole of human life is in effect one bit of suffering followed by another, an occasional pause where you satisfy your desire, but immediately you start wanting something else. It has a very powerful a rather depressing picture of human desire, human existence. That's what we are. There's no ultimate value, there's no ultimate grand plan, there's no God, there's no... Right. So it's a very... He's often called a pessimist. He didn't call himself that, but that's Schopenhauer's view of the world. So tragedy, he's very interested in the arts, and he thinks tragedy is really important because it just shows us what human life is. Human life is striving away and in the end simply suffering for no real ultimate purpose. So tragedy confronts us with what life's really like. As you say, you'll see in this little passage, he talks about different kinds of tragedy, ancient tragedy and more modern kinds. But he says, just take this as a view about tragedy as such, tragedy shows us the sort of powers that destroy life and happiness, and that can any moment make their way towards us as well, where the greatest suffering is brought about by entanglements essentially the same as those assumed by our own fate. Right, maybe on a bigger scale, more extremely, but actually it's showing us that really we're not here to be happy, we're here to encounter suffering ultimately. Although through actions that we too might perhaps be capable of committing, so that we may not complain of injustice, then we shudder as we feel ourselves already in the middle of hell. So here's a view that, well, it's actually slightly unclear whether he thinks this is something, going back to the first point, whether Schopenhauer thinks, well, it's quite enjoyable to be in this state. It doesn't look like it. It looks as if the point of this is to make us feel fear, to make us shudder and think, yes, that's the truth about human life. And this, of course, could be a value of tragedy. It needn't be that its value is that it entertains us, makes us feel happy. Its value might be that it is a way of confronting truth which we'd rather not face. Right? So its value could be, as we say, cognitive or educational. It gives us some kind of knowledge and insight which it's quite hard to face up to. So we may not enjoy it, but in some sense it's good for us to know it. And we might think this about many truths, that truth is, knowing the truth is often valuable even though it's not enjoyable to know it. So this, at least in this part of, Schopenhauer has a lot to say about aesthetic pleasure and all the different art forms, which is he's very interesting on art. But this seems to be the view that, well, what's good about it is it reflects reality. Not just what might happen, but actually in some sense our own condition, the human condition in some sense, writ large. Well, finally, Nietzsche. Well, Nietzsche takes this. Nietzsche was a classical scholar. He was a brilliant classical scholar, and he studied all the ancient literature. He also got rather interested in Schopenhauer, but he thought, well, Schopenhauer's view, in a way, was that what tragedy can really do for us is make us realize that there's no value in our own existence. It can turn us, it can resign us against life. There's no point trying to get anything because nothing is ultimately of any value. This seems to be Schopenhauer's view. The tragedy is good because it shows us, well, just, forget about happiness. Nietzsche, I think, thought originally that was quite a powerful idea, but eventually came to see that it was too negative. So part of what he's doing in his early book is a kind of transitional book in which he's still working on these Schopenhauerian ideas. So he thinks the Greeks had a vision similar to Schopenhauer's, that life is short and in effect leads to nothing except suffering. So he tells this story. There's a folk tale in Greek legend about a character called Silenus whose wisdom is, it would have been better not to have been born. Life is just a torment, really, and it'd be better not to have been born. The next best thing is to die soon. So he quotes this as it's part of the Greek tradition, this myth. So tragedy, Nietzsche thought, was a way in which the Greek culture found of confronting and dealing with that vision of life by turning it into an aesthetic spectacle So the famous quote from this rather difficult and intricate book, the most famous quote that comes out of it is the one at the end here: "Only as an aesthetic phenomenon is existence in the world truly justified." So by acknowledging this supposed truth that life is, it would be better not to exist because life contains so much terror and suffering, by acknowledging that vision but turning it into a spectacle that we can observe from a more detached viewpoint, it's a way of actually confronting the truth through fiction, if you like, or through a representation with just distance enough from it that we can actually enjoy the thought that individuals suffer and get destroyed. We're in a spectator position. We recognise the individuals are some sense like us, but we're distanced enough by the aesthetic phenomenon, the aesthetic context, to be able to enjoy seeing that happen. So Nietzsche's view is, in some way, this was the best art form that the Greeks created, and it enabled them actually to have a positive attitude to life because they could enjoy even the spectacle of it being terrible. So there's a kind of strength, a kind of courage, a kind of honesty and integrity in tragedy for Nietzsche, which then gets lost by subsequent culture. He thinks that Plato and Socrates, by being ultra-rationalists, lost the ability to deal with these uncomfortable truths. Socrates' idea is if you're good, you'll be happy. And if you're rational, you can work out what is good, which seems to Nietzsche to have just destroyed the whole vision that the tragic Greek culture had of human life. And Nietzsche wants to revive it, and he thinks at this point, Wagner's operas are going to revive this, Goethe, Demerong and Tristan and Isolde are going to revive tragedy for the modern European age. He went off Wagner afterwards. But that's what this book is about. So it's about the idea that Greek tragedy embodied some real genuine wisdom which got lost and we can somehow recover. It's a very florid book. It's quite difficult to read, but it's certainly an important book, The Birth of Tragedy. So those are just a few snapshots, right? So we're dealing with some quite difficult issues. I mean, things that are difficult to think about, do we ever really attain happiness in life, or is it the way Schopenhauer thinks? What is pleasure? Can we feel pleasure in things that we recognize to be painful? Are there values that, the value of truth, discovering truth, for example, which excludes pleasure, or is there a pleasure in discovering truth? All of these are very difficult questions that this phenomenon of tragedy seems to raise, and that's why philosophers ever since Plato and to this day are still interested in this phenomenon. We have tragedies, we obviously perhaps most experienced with the Shakespearean tragedies, but as I've said, other literary forms like novels and also films and so on, plays that we write today often have a tragic structure. So it's something that we've still got in our culture, and something philosophers are still interested in. Okay, well, I'll stop there and we can have a bit of a discussion.